Welcome to the Intro to Alpine.js course here on Scrimba. Alpine.js is a rugged minimal framework for composing JavaScript behavior in your markup. So why would you choose Alpine.js? In my opinion, it's not meant to replace frameworks like Vue or React, but serve as an alternative. If you have a highly interactive single-page app, I would stick to using a framework like Vue or React. I think Alpine's best use case is when minimal JavaScript is needed. For example, you just need one or two components like dropdowns, tabs, or modals. It's great for server-rendered apps like Laravel or Rails, where you just need to toggle some JavaScript components. The syntax is very similar, if not exactly the same as Vue, but there is no virtual DOM, so it's easier to set up with no build steps. Where you put the code is also different from Vue, and we'll be exploring that in this course. Its secondary tagline is it's like Tailwind CSS for JavaScript. Tailwind CSS is a utility-first CSS framework where you write all your styles within your HTML. So Alpine.js is very similar, where you write most of your JavaScript inline in your HTML. So this also allows you to easily write declarative code as opposed to procedural code that you might write with vanilla JavaScript. Alpine also has a very small footprint. It's only 4 kilobytes gzipped. So here's an example component in Alpine. It is a dropdown, and we have some data or some state using the x-data HTML attribute. And we have an event listener using @click, which is similar to Vue. And we have this x-show directive, which allows you to toggle components based on certain state. So we'll be taking a look at different components within this course. Here are some examples we will build. A dropdown like I just showed you, an accordion toggle, tabs, modals, and scroll detection. So as for prerequisites, knowledge of the following technologies is not required, but will be helpful as, like I said, Alpine and Vue are very similar in terms of syntax. And I'll be using Tailwind CSS for styling, which you don't have to know, but I actually think it's easier to follow along as you see all the styles being declared right in the HTML. So my name is Andre. I am a full stack developer and YouTuber where I teach web development concepts around Laravel, Vue, and Tailwind CSS. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this course. Okay, let's take a look at installation and making our first Alpine component. So installation is really easy. You can either use npm and install it like that, or you can just use a CDN and plop it into your head section over here, and that should be all the steps. So there's something refreshing about just using a CDN and having everything work, as opposed to having multiple build steps in order for everything to get working. So like I said earlier, Alpine.js does not have a virtual DOM, and it just works with the real DOM, so there are no additional build steps required. So let's go ahead and make a very simple component here. So as you can see on the right, we have the browser open here, and remember this is a Scrimba course, so at any point you can pause the video and interact with the code here. So be sure to do that if you don't understand something at any point. So I'm just going to make a button here, and I just want to toggle this H1 underneath it. So let's go ahead and do that, save that, and we just want to show and hide this when we click this. So the first step of using Alpine is to define state. So your state goes wherever you need it, and the scope of that state is the same scope as the selector you put it in. So for example, if I have a div wrapping these two elements, we can put state, let me just indent these two, right here. So we use the x-data HTML attribute, and we define state using an object. So very similar to the data object in Vue, if you've used Vue before. And we'll just make a new piece of state called isOpen, and we'll default it to false or true. So like I said, this piece of state is available within the scope of this div. So it's available within these two elements. So now to show or hide the thing we want to show or hide, in this case just the H1, we can use the x-show directive, and we just give it the piece of state, so isOpen. So in this case, if you set this to false and save this, there you see the H1 is hidden. But if you change it to true, you see it appear. So now we just have to set an event listener on the button to change that piece of state. So to do that, we can use the X on directive, and we give it the event name, in this case click, and then we just want to toggle that piece of state. So we just set is open to not is open. So it just flips whatever the current state is. And now if I toggle this, there you go, it toggles that H1. So if you want a shorthand for this click directive, instead of X on, you can just do at, and that will be the same result. So there we go. We've installed Alpine. We've made a basic component, and you have an understanding of how to declare state and how to declare event listeners. Okay, let's see how we would implement a dropdown component in Alpine. So I have all the HTML and CSS scaffolded out here, and this is how it looks like. Typical dropdown with a button that toggles it in the top right. So I am making use of Tailwind CSS here. So if you're not familiar with Tailwind CSS, like I said, it is a utility-first CSS framework where we just write classes, and each of these classes maps to a CSS property. So for example, absolute maps to position absolute, mt2 maps to margin top with a unit. So I have some more examples here. Flex maps to display flex, justify between maps to justify content space between, and pretty much every CSS property has a utility for it. And you don't have to write any CSS classes. So this file is just an example. So if you want to learn more about Tailwind, definitely check out the website at tailwindcss.com, or there is a course here on Scrimba for Tailwind CSS. So definitely check that out. So back to our dropdown. This is pretty much exactly like the last video. There's just more HTML elements that make up the dropdown here. So to give you a hint, the actual dropdown is this UL here. So I'm going to add the hidden class here, and all hidden is just display none in Tailwind. So if I save that, you'll see that the dropdown is now hidden. So with that knowledge, I'm going to leave some silence here, and if you want, you can go ahead and try to implement the dropdown based on the knowledge you already have from the last video. Okay, I hope you got it working. Let's go ahead and complete it together now. So let me just put this back. And let's define our state as the first step. So I'm going to put it within this div because this div encapsulates the button, which is this avatar and the chevron down and the actual dropdown. So we'll put x data equals is open. Actually, that is a object, so let's do that. And let's set it to false by default. And like I said, the thing we want to toggle is this UL, which is the dropdown over here. So let's go ahead and do x show equals is open. So if I save this, it is false by default, and that should disappear. And it does, cool. So now on the button, we can just toggle it. So we can use the click event handler and just set is open to not is open. And now that should toggle. So if we click this button, you'll see it toggle. Cool. So a few things I want to show you here. Oftentimes with the dropdown or other components, you want to click off of it and have that hide as well. So there is a handy modifier you can use here, and I'll show you how to do that. So for the thing you want to click off of, you can set another event on that. So in this case, it's the UL. We can do add click dot away, and then we can set the state here. So in this case, it'll be is open, is false. So now, if I click away, that should hide. It does. Cool. And another way you might want to hide the toggle is hitting escape. So say you click it, you want to hit escape. We can do that as well. So we can do that on the button. So when the button is focused, we can do listen for the key down dot escape. So this is a modifier. You can put several keys here. for example, enter or arrow keys, but in our case it's escape. And we just want to do the same thing. So is open is false. And now save that, click this, hit escape, and there we go, it hides. So I hope you went ahead and tried this out and got the solution. If not, go ahead and rewind the video and try it for yourself again. Okay, let's take a look at this modal example here. So we want to be able to close the modal and show it when we click the button. So right now it's in a popped up state, but if I add the hidden class here, so hidden is just display none in Tailwind CSS, and save, you'll see that the modal is gone. So just a quick overview of the CSS needed to create the modal. So this div I'm in right now is the modal. And it's just positioned absolutely, as you see the absolute class here. And we have an h full and a width full. So that's this width 100% and height 100%. And it's pinned to the top and the left. So top 0 and left 0. So if I remove the absolute class, so I'm just going to misspell it here. This might give you a better idea of how it works. So as you see now, it's not positioned absolutely. So it's within the document flow. So now we just want to show and hide the modal when we click this button or the close button. So this is pretty much like the previous examples. So if you want to go ahead and try doing this, I'm going to leave some silence so you can try it out, and then I will be back within a few seconds. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement this together. So I'm going to put our state in this div. So x data equals, say, is open, is set it to false by default. And let's set the x show on the actual modal. So x show equals is open. So now if I save this, that should be gone, and it is. So for the open modal class, or the button I mean, we can add an event listener on that. So add click, and let's set is open to true. And let's do the same for the close button. So the close button is down here. Let me just rearrange this. And we can do the same thing, but set it to false. Okay, so now open, close. So let me just put this absolute back, and that should work. Awesome. So I want to introduce you to refs here, or references. So what I want to do is focus the close button once the modal is open. So I want this to be focused. So we need a reference to this close modal button. So we can just call the .focus method on it. And that's just vanilla JavaScript. So let's go ahead and put a reference on this close button. So this is it right here. Let me just fix this. Okay. So to do that, we can do xref and give it a name. I'm going to name it modal close button. And in the click handler for open modal, we want to focus that button. So you can have multiple statements here if you want. So I'm going to put it on its own line. And to grab the refs, we just have to do $refs and give it the name. So modal close button, and call the focus method. So that's not going to work. So let's try that. And I'll show you why. So open, and it's not focused. So we have to make use of the next tick magic property, and that allows you to execute a given expression after Alpine has made its reactive DOM updates. So let's go ahead and use next tick. So I'm just going to use next $next tick here. And that is a function that returns a callback. So let's go ahead and do that. And now, if I did this correctly, this should focus. And it does. Cool. So yeah, whenever you need a reference to a DOM node, make use of refs. Okay, let's take a look at this sidebar example. This is pretty much the same as the previous examples where we just want to toggle the visibility of the component. Sorry for being so repetitive, but I just want to make sure you understand everything. And I also want to take a look at transitions later on for all these components that we've built so far. So go ahead and try this on your own. You should already know how to do this. So let me leave some silence here while you go ahead and try it on your own. Okay, let's go ahead and implement this. Again, let's start with the state. And I'm going to put it within this nav element here. So x data equals is open true in an object. Or let's start it off as false. And then this div here is the sidebar. So again, if I put hidden, which is display none in Tailwind, you'll see that it's gone. So this is the one we want to v-show on. Actually, I already have hidden here. So let me remove that and let's do x show on is open. So this should be false when I save it. So it should be gone. But if I change this to true, that should show. Okay, so it does work. Let's change this back to false by default. And all we have to do is set the event listener on each of these buttons. So this one is the one to toggle it on. So we can do at click equals is open true. And then we can do the same for the close button, which is right here. So let's just put it here and let's set it to false. Okay, there we go. Opens and closes. Let's also do a click away on this. So if you click away, that should hide it too. So that would be on this sidebar. So at click dot away equals is open is false. Click it and click away from it and it hides. So yeah, you should already be familiar with this. Later on, we will add a transition that slides in and out the sidebar from the left. Okay, let's take a look at this tabs component here. As always, I have the HTML and CSS already scaffolded out, and we just have to add the code for Alpine.js. So this one's a bit more involved than our previous examples, as we now have to hold state for not just a Boolean, but for the tab that is opened. We also have to conditionally render a class based on that state. So if you click tab 2, we want this to be in an active state, and same for tab 3. And the default would be tab 1. So if you want, you can go ahead and try this. If not, let's go ahead and build this together. So as always, we have to define state on a HTML element that encapsulates everything you want. So in this case, I'm going to put it in this div right here. So let's go ahead and do x data. And let's hold the state for the active tab. So in this case, we will store that as a string. So let's just do tab, and let's say the default is tab 1. And this will change based on whatever the user clicks. So tab 2 and tab 3. And for each one of these tabs, we have to set a event listener. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to put this on its own line. And let's put the event listener on here. So I'm going to do click.prevent. Prevent just does prevent default. So in the case of an anchor tag, nothing's going to happen. Actually, if you have a hash, it's going to go to the top of the page. So make sure to tack on that prevent default. And we just want to set the tab here. So in this case, we're setting the tab to be tab 1. And we want to do the same for the other ones, but set the tab accordingly. And this one is to clean this up a bit and put it right here. Okay. And this is tab 3. Let me just clean this up. Okay, for now, I just want to change the content section to show the contents of the tab that was clicked. So right now we only have one div. Let's make 2 more. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it. And each one of these will correspond to the open tab. So this will be tab 2 content, and this will be tab 3 content. So now we just want to set the X show, and we just want it to correspond to the respective tab. So tab equals tab 1 for this one, and let me just copy this and paste it in here for tab 2, and paste it in here for tab 3. And now this should work. So tab 1 content, tab 2 content, tab 3 content. Okay. But now we have to take care of the case when we click on this, we want the styles for the active tab to be on here. So let's go ahead and take care of that. So right now for the first tab, I have the styles for the active tab applied to this first one here. So it would be all of these. So BG white, text blue 700, and the border on the left, top and right. This only applies to active tabs. So let me cut that out. And now this will look like the rest of the tabs. So now we only want to add those classes if that certain tab is active. So to do conditional class rendering, we would use this syntax, and we would give it an object like this. And for that object, the key is the classes you want to apply, and the value is the condition we want to apply those classes. So for this one, we just want it to be when the tab is tab 1. So let me grab this whole thing and we paste it in here. And let's do the same thing. So tab is tab 2, and it's pasted in here too. And tab is tab 3. So let's see if that works. And it does. Cool. So we successfully implemented tabs using Alpine. Again, if you want to try this out yourself, rewind the video and try to apply what you learned here. We'll take a look at another similar example in the next video. Okay, let's take a look at this image selection example. So the idea here is we click on one of the thumbnails and a larger image appears here. You see this across many e-commerce sites on the internet. So if you think about it, this is just actually tabs, but now we're just using images instead of text. So these thumbnail images would be the tabs, and the larger images would be the content of those tabs. So definitely try to implement this yourself using what you learned from the last video, and then I will be back and we can implement it together. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement this. So as always, let's define some state. So just like tabs, we need to keep track of which image we're on. So I'm going to define some state in this div here. So let's do x data equals, and let's make a piece of state called image, and it's defaulted to image 1. And now when we click on one of these links, we want to set that piece of state to the image we selected. So add click, let's add prevent here, equals, and we'll just set that image equals, so image 1 for this one, and let's grab that and let's do the same for the rest of them. So let's add it for this one, and we'll set it to image 2, and let's add it for this one, and let's set it to image 3. And now we want to show the large images based on the state. So for this one, it's x show equals, and let's just do image equals image 1, and let's do the same for the rest of them. I'm just going to copy this, actually copy the whole thing and make 2 more, and let's change this to image 2 and image 3, and let's change these images. So this one would be the Pro Display XDR, and this one will be the MacBook Pro. Okay, save this, and let's see if the image changes. It does, cool. Now, if you want an active state, we can do that as well. Let's go ahead and make a class here, and let's set it to an object, and let's set it to border blue 500 if the image is image 1 for this case. So let's go ahead and grab that, and let's paste it on the other ones. So let's set it for this one as well. And let's set it to image 2, and let's set it for this one as well. And let's set it to image 3. Okay. And I'm missing a closing brace here, so let's add it to these two. Actually, sorry, that goes outside of the single quote. Okay. Okay, let me save that. And now we should have an active state. I think there's an extra space here. And I'm missing a closing quote here, and that looks better. Try it again. And it's very subtle, but you can see a blue border on the active image. So yeah, I hope you're able to get that solution on your own. If not, try rewinding and try again. So let's go ahead and build a scroll detection component example. So what I want to have happen here is as I scroll down, well, number one, I want this to be fixed. And as I scroll down, I want the background of this to change color. So you see this often on websites where there is a hero section and the nav is transparent in the hero section. But as you scroll down, it should have its own background. So let's go ahead and implement this. So first thing I want to do is make the nav fixed. So this will just give it position fixed. So now you see it's fixed to the top. And let's just give this more padding on the top. So I'm just going to add some padding to the top. Okay. And now let's go ahead and define some state that keeps track if we've scrolled a little bit. So again, it's just going to be a Boolean. So let's do x data equals an object. And let's call our variable at top, which will keep track if it's on the top. Okay, so it's true by default because we are at the top by default. And now I want to add a scroll event listener on the window itself. So it listens in on the entire window and not just the element I added to. So to do that, we set the scroll event listener, but we add the .window modifier. So it listens on the entire window. So every time it scrolls, we want to set at top, and this is going to be a conditional. And the condition is, just put it in brackets here, window.page y offset is greater than some threshold. So I'm just going to say 20. And if that's the case, set at top to false. And if not, it's still at the top. Okay. And now we just want to set some conditional class rendering. So that would be on the nav itself. So let's give this an object. And the classes we want to add is just make it white. And let's give it a shadow. Okay. And the condition is if we are not at the top, because it changes as we scroll down. So that should work. Let's give it a try. And there we go. After we reach a certain threshold, then the background changes. So you can change this to whatever you want. So if you want it lower, just change it to a bigger number. So it won't change until you hit this threshold here. There we go. Cool. Okay, let's take a look at this accordion toggle component. So I have a bunch of FAQs with questions and answers, and I want to be able to toggle the visibility of the answers for each question. So let's take a look at doing this the way we've been doing it so far, and then we'll take a look at some of the problems with that, and then we'll refactor it to use loops. So as always, let's go ahead and add some state. So for each question and answer, there is a div that wraps it. So we'll start with this one over here. So let's do x data equals is open false as always. Okay. And let's set the X show on the answer here. So is open. And now that should be hidden, and it is. Let's go ahead and set the event listener on the button. So add click equals is open equals not is open. So now that should toggle the visibility of it. Okay, it does. And I also want these buttons to show depending on the current state. So I want the plus to show when it's hidden and the minus to show when it's expanded here. So we just have to set an X show on the SVG. So we want plus if it's not open. So if not open, and the same thing for the minus, but when it is open. So let's add that. Okay, see if that works. Sorry, this should be is open. So let's try that. Okay, so now the appropriate button shows. Okay, so one of the problems with this approach is that it only works for this question. If you want it to work on all the questions, you're going to have to copy and paste this and change the question accordingly. Not the end of the world, but there is a lot of repeated code. Another option would be to move this state higher up, and then each question will have its own state to check if it's open or not. But I still feel like there is a lot of repeated code with that approach. So the third approach is to use loops here. So the idea is to store all our questions and answers in an array, loop over them, and then set the event listener on each of them for each iteration in the loop. So let's go ahead and take that approach. So I am going to make a piece of state. Actually, let me undo everything first. So I'm just going to Command Z on everything here. So we're back to our original state here. Okay. And now I'm going to set some state here. So I'm going to put it in this div. So x data equals, and let's make it an object. And I'm going to put it on its own line here. And like I said, we are going to store the FAQs in an array. So it's going to be an array of objects, and I'm just going to paste that in. So as you see, we have 3 questions here. And I'm also storing the state for if that question is open or not. So just a Boolean. Okay, now let's take a look at what's repeating here. So like I said earlier, this div is what's repeating for each question. So now we can just loop over this since we have everything in the array and just change that accordingly to display each loop in, so each iteration in the loop. So let's delete these 2 questions. So we only have 1. Okay, so now we should only have 1. Cool. And let's go ahead and loop over this. So to do loops in Alpine, we have to wrap the thing we want to loop over in a template tag and give it the x4 directive. And we want to loop over the FAQs. And for each iteration in the loop, we want to store it as FAQ. X4 FAQ in FAQs. And for loops, you always have to have a key, and that key has to be unique. So in our case, let's just say FAQ.question, since each question is unique. So let's do that. Let's close out the template tag. Okay, and let me just reindent this. Okay, now we should have 3 since we're looping over them. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, but we are still hard coding the questions and answers. So let's go ahead and change that. So instead of this, which is hard coded, we can grab it from the loop. So we can use the x text directive to set the text or the inner text of this element. So that would just be FAQ.question. And let's do the same for the answer. So I'm just going to grab this and put it in the answer here. So let me just remove this. And this is the answer now. FAQ.answer. And I guess we don't need this. I mean, we still need it, but we don't need it on its own line since it's just one div. Okay, save that. And now we are getting this data from our array. Awesome. So now we can pretty much do what we did earlier, but each question will now have the ability to show and hide. So for the answer, we want to show it if, and again, we have the state in the object now. So FAQ.isOpen. And for the button, let's go ahead and add a click event. And all we want to do is set FAQ.isOpen to not FAQ.isOpen. Okay. And now this should toggle, and it does. And now it should work for each question. And let's go ahead and change the icons here so they match accordingly. So again, same thing we did earlier. So X, show the plus button if FAQ is not open. And the same for the other case, but for when it is open. So FAQ.isOpen. Okay, cool. So now we have these FAQs and we can toggle the visibility of them. So when you have multiple instances of the same thing, you probably want to make use of loops in Alpine. So you can even probably make use of loops in our tabs example, but in that case, I didn't think loops were necessary as it wasn't too much repeated code. But in this case, I think it's a much cleaner solution. So yeah, I encourage you to rewind the video and re-implement what we just did here using loops for our FAQ accordion toggle. Okay, so let's see how we can make requests to an external API. So all this app is supposed to do is grab a quote from an external API and display it here. So let's start by adding some state to hold the quote. So X data equals, and let's say quote, and let's make it an empty string. And we're going to use a new directive here called x-init, and this runs when Alpine is initialized. So this is where we'll make our network request. But for now, let's just set the quote to something else. Awesome quote. Oops. Quote equals awesome quote. Okay. And now let's set this, instead of hard coding it, let's set the x text equals quote. Okay. And I am going to use template strings and put this in a variable so I can add the quote here. So I'm going to use the encoded version of a quote. So that's QUOT. Let's put one at the end too. Sorry, that would be and quote with the and sign. Like that and like that. Sorry, it's so hard to see this. Okay, I should go outside. There we go. So now we want to make use of an external API and populate our quote variable here. So let's just use fetch here and let's go and grab a quote. So let's fetch, and I'm going to grab it from an API called Kanye.rest, just a REST API for Kanye West quotes. So the URL is api.kanye.rest. And that's going to return an object with a quote field. And we can grab that. Just do .then response.json, change it to JSON. And then let's go ahead and grab the data that comes back. And let's set our quote to the quote coming back. So data.quote. And let's see if this works. There we go. So every time I save the app, it grabs a new quote from the API and displays it here. So yeah, for any initialization you need to do, make use of this x-init directive. Okay, let's build a mini to-do app. This component is a bit more involved than the components we've been building, so let's go ahead and get started. So as always, we have to think about the state we need in our app. So in this case, we need 3 pieces of state. We need to keep the keep the to-dos in an array. We need to keep track of whatever the user types in for a new to-do, and we need to keep track of the new to-do ID. So that's 3 pieces of state. So we can do x data equals the 3 pieces of state in an object, but that can get a bit messy as we have a lot of state. So what we can do is extract to either a script tag or an external JavaScript file to make it a bit cleaner. So I'm going to add a function here called add to-dos, and I'm going to put a script tag down here. And again, this can be in an external file if you want. So I'm just going to put a script file here, close that out. And now we can make a function called to-dos. Sorry, what did I name it? Add to-dos? No, let's name it to-dos here. So function to-dos down here. And we are going to return an object. And this object will contain our state and our functions. So let's make one piece of state called to-dos. And like I said, I am going to store the to-dos in here. So I'm just going to hard code 1 in here. So ID 1. Let's call it title. And let's call it finish Alpine screencast. And let's keep track if it's complete or not. So is complete and say it's false. And we can add the other two pieces of state that I mentioned. So the other one is the to-do title. So that is when a user types something in here. So that will be empty by default. And we also need to keep track of that ID. So to-do ID. Since I have 1 in the hard-coded array, let's start at 2 here. And then we'll increment as we add to-dos. Okay, so save that. And now this state should be populated with our state here. So now we can just loop over the to-dos. So I'm going to get rid of these two. And then we'll loop over this first one here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make a template tag. And let's do x4 equals to-do in to-dos. And the key is going to be to-do.id. Okay. And let's close out this template tag. And let's go ahead and indent this. Okay. Okay, so it looks like it is reading from that array, but this is hard-coded. So let's change this to what we have in the array. So that would be x text equals to-do.title. Okay, and that should pull from here now. So if I just change this, it does work. Cool. And we also want to put a line through. So the class is line through in Tailwind if it's complete. So that should be a conditional class if it's complete. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do class equals and give it an object. And line through is the class we want to apply. And the condition is if to-do is complete. So if I change this to true, that should be a line through. Awesome. Okay. So let's go ahead and add a to-do here. And once we do, we add it to the to-dos array here. So in this input, I'm going to make a new directive here called x-modal. And what this does is it syncs this variable you give it, so in our case, to-do title, with whatever's typed in the input. And the event we want to listen to is key down enter. So let me just rearrange some stuff here. And let's put the model on its own line. And let's go ahead and put the event here. So at key down, and the modifier is we're listening for the enter key. And we want to call an add to do method once that happens. So we can add methods right here. Let's do add to do. And let's just do some protection so it doesn't add it if it's an empty string. So this dot to do title. Again, this syncs with whatever the user's typing in the input. So if trim is white space, then just return. So do nothing. But if it does contain something, we want to push to the to-dos array. So this .todos.push, and we want to give it a to-do object. So the ID is this .todo ID, and the title is this to-do title, and is complete is false. Okay. And after that's done, we want to increment the to-do ID. So this dot to-do ID plus plus. And we want to set the input title to an empty string. So this dot to-do title is an empty string. So now, if I did everything correctly, if I type something in here, it should show here. Hello. And it does work. Awesome. And let me just put some margin on the top here. So there's a bit more space. Does that look better? Okay, cool. So for checking to-dos here, if they're complete, we can also use xModal on the checkbox here. So just like we're using xModal on the input, we can do xModal on the checkbox. And we want to set that to the to-do.isComplete. And that will set it either to true or false if it's checked or not. And that should put the line through. Awesome. So let's try more. And let's try to check that. And it does work. Cool. And the last thing we want to do is delete a to-do if they check or press the X button. So let's go ahead and do that. So that's this button right here. So let's put a click handler on that. Click equals delete to-do. And I'm going to pass in the to-do.id. So let's go ahead and make that delete to-do function. So right after add to-do, let's add delete to-do. So that would be after this. Make sure to put a comma, delete to-do. And that takes in an ID. So let's put that here. And you can use the splice function on arrays, but I'm just going to use a more functional approach and use filter. So we just want to reassign to-dos, and we want to reassign it to everything except the to-do with the ID being passed in. So this dot to-dos dot filter, that takes in the to-do, and just make sure the ID does not equal to-do dot ID. So I hope that makes sense. So now, if I did this correctly, if I save, add a view, delete this, and it's gone. Awesome. So even if there's more JavaScript logic required, like in this example, you can extract it to either a script tag or an external JavaScript file. So your template is cleaner and you can just write JavaScript here instead of in your HTML. So at this point, you should ask yourself if Alpine is the right choice. If the logic starts to get heavy, then you're probably better off with another framework like Vue or React. For example, for an app like this is still okay in Alpine, but when you start getting to making network requests, again, you can do that in Alpine, but I would highly consider using something else like a Vue instead of Alpine. But nonetheless, you can still use Alpine and extract logic to dedicated script tags or external files like I've showed here. Okay, let's take a look at transitions here. We'll start with the dropdown that we built earlier, and we want to transition the dropdown once we click on it and it becomes visible. So I have some information from the documentation for Alpine, and here is the example that they give. And as you see, it says Alpine offers 6 different transition directives for applying classes to various stages of an element's transition between hidden and shown states. So it works with xShow and xIf. So you only use this when you are dealing with components that have xShow or xIf. So in this case we do, so we can use these directives. And these classes are applied at different stages of the transition. So you can see the description here. So let's go ahead and copy these and try it out in our component. So we want to add these directives to wherever the xShow is. So in this case, it's the dropdown and it's right here. So let's go ahead and paste that in. And let me just re-indent this. And let's start from scratch here. So I'm going to remove everything here and we'll add it in from scratch. And I am making use of Tailwind's utility classes. And they just added support for transition classes in Tailwind 1.2, which is what I'm using here. So transition enter. So if you look at the documentation, it says applied during the entire entering phase. So the first thing you want to specify here is the transition type, or what you want to transition. So in our case, we'll just use the transition utility. And I have some examples of what Tailwind does. So for transition, it just sets the transition property to these properties here. If you want to do transition all, you can use this as well. So we'll just use transition since it reads nice. We're just going to transition opacity for now. So we'll just have the drop-down fade in. And transition does include opacity right here. And this is just an example. I'm pulling in Tailwind from the CDN here. So up here. Okay, so transition. The next thing we want to set is the easing function here, or how the animation behaves. So default is linear, I believe. And here are some other ones. So ease in, ease out, and ease linear. So let's do ease out. So the animation slows down towards the end. So let's go ahead and do ease out. And the next thing we want to define is the duration. So duration is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the duration of the animation. So there's different values here. Again, these are just examples. There's more values here. So I'm going to set it pretty high so you can see it, and then we'll change it later on once it's working. So 500 milliseconds. So enter start is added before an element is inserted. So this is where you want to specify how it starts out. So in this case, we just want to fade it in. So it's starting out invisible. So opacity 0 is pretty self-explanatory. So enter end is when entering finishes. So in this case, we want to specify what that looks like. And leave is pretty much the opposite of enter. So for leaving, we want the same thing here. So we'll just copy that. So we'll do the opposite for this one. So when it starts to leave, it's at opacity 100. And when it leaves, it's invisible. Okay, so let's see if this works. So I'm going to save this. And now when I click this, there you see, it fades in and fades out with all of these properties. So for example, if I wanted to make it even slower, so that's 1 second, there you see that transition happens within 1 second. So if you want to do something extra here, so say I wanted to grow or scale as it comes in and comes out, so we can add some classes here. So scale 75 when it starts. So scale is just this size of it. So scale, do I have an example here? Yeah, so transform scale 0.75 when it starts. And when it ends, we want it to be the correct size, so scale 100. And for this, leave start, scale 100 to start, and scale 75. And we also have to add the transform class if we're making use of any transforms here. So let's do transform, and now see if this works. So it does. Awesome. So as you see, it starts from the middle. So there is another utility class we can use. I think I have it in the examples here. Just origin top right if you want it to start from the top right when it's scaling. So we can define that in here, wherever there's a transform. So let me just select both of these and we'll do origin top right, save, and now it should grow from the top right, and it does. Awesome. So let me just change this back to duration, say 200 is a good value for me. You can set it to whatever you like, and that seems pretty good. So yeah, that may look like a lot of code to write, but now we have fine-grained control over everything about our transitions, from the duration to the opacity and so on and so forth. So I want you to go ahead and try to add a transition on this modal we built in a previous video. So make sure you saw the last video where I went over how to use transitions in Alpine with Tailwind's utility classes. So I'm going to leave a few seconds of silence here for you to try, and then I will be back to implement it. Okay, so let's just give it a basic fade. So let's start with the transition class. And let's ease out. And let's give it a duration of really quick. So 100 milliseconds is good for me. This is going to be the same for leave. And when we start, we want it to be invisible, so opacity 0. When we finish the entering phase, we want it to be opacity 100. And same thing for this, but in the opposite direction. So opacity 0. So that should give it a nice fade. There we go. Awesome. Okay, let's work on the transition for this sidebar that we created earlier. So we want to slide in and out once we press the button. So let's go ahead and start. So we want to transition here. Let's ease out and let's set the duration to 300 milliseconds. And this will be the same for transition leave. So let's copy that and let's put it in leave. Now for start, there is not anything. For end, we want to transform and we want to translate along the x-axis 64, and that will just slide it to the right. And this will be the same for leaving end, but in the opposite direction. So there is a class that's negative. So let's see if this works. And it seems to be an issue. So leave looks okay, but I think we have to add a margin left here, or a negative margin left. So negative margin left 64 when the transition enters. So let's see if that works. There we go. We have a nice smooth transition for our sidebar here. Awesome. Okay, let's take a look at an alternate transition syntax. So we need to change the version of Alpine to a newer version. So at the time of this recording, it's 2.01. Okay, and let's verify this still works. Okay, and instead of writing all these classes out, let me just cut this out so we can refer to it. I'm just gonna put a comment here and just paste that in. Now we can just write transitions right within the X show directive. So if you just want one with sensible defaults, just tack on transition here, and that should work. Actually, let me verify that the transition is gone first. Okay, and now if I do this, transition, there should be a default transition on this. So it has opacity and scale. Cool. So you can change the values of the transition if you want. So if you want a longer duration, just do dot duration and how long you want it to be in milliseconds. So now that should be 1 second. Cool. And as you see, we have both a scale and a fade. If you only want fade, just tack on opacity. And now it should be only fade. Cool. If you only want scale, then just do dot scale. And that should work. And the scale initially or by default is pretty high. So let's set it to something lower so you can see the scale happen. There we go. If you want the origin to be the top right, like we have down here, let's go ahead and do that. Origin top right. Okay, there we go. And you can combine them as well. So let's re-add opacity here. And that should combine everything. Cool. So if you do duration here, then it will set the in duration to what you put here, but the out duration is set to half of this. So if you want control over the timing for the in and out durations, just add on the word in here before the duration. So now all of this stuff happens for the in duration, but now we've lost what we have for the out duration. So let me save that. In duration is the same, but out duration is gone. Okay, but we can re-add that by just adding everything again with the out duration. So let's set it to 1 second as well, or let's say it's 2 seconds so you can see it and see if that works. So in and out. So out works, but it has the default transitions. So let's go ahead and add everything again, just like we have everything specified in and out down here. So let's do opacity, scale 25, origin top right. Okay, so that should do it. And now it should be opposite. So in and out. Cool. Okay, so now we just have to set these timings to something sensible. So let's set it to 200 and let's set this to 200 as well. And now that should be something like what we had before. Awesome. So yeah, definitely make use of this syntax if this seems like too much code for you to write. So we've taken a look at how to use Alpine.js and built out a few example components of where Alpine might be a good choice over React or Vue. You've seen its similarities with Vue, and hopefully you can see where it can be useful in your applications. So I've personally already made use of Alpine.js in some of my production apps that are server-driven Laravel apps. So also be sure to check out Alpine's GitHub page where you can keep up to date with its development and any new news. With that being said, thank you for joining me in this course. I hope you learned something new about Alpine.js. To keep up to date with me, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and you can follow me on Twitter. Thanks again and have a great day.